like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Jennifer Hurt. She's the Gilbert L. Stark Professor of Christian Ethics at Yale University and has written monographs on the history of the concept of Bildung in late 18th and early 19th century German philosophy, as well as on early modern transformations of Christian virtue ethics. The title of her talk is From Freedom to Final End, MacIntyre's Hegelian Aristotle. We're very glad to have you here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hurt.
Thank you so much, David. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conference. I've always seen MacIntyre as in some way deeply Hegelian, but had never really taken time to try to think through the ways in which he is and is not. And so I welcome this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to all of the conversations. So, I mean, it certainly seemed to me that in order to bring into focus what links Hegel and MacIntyre, one has to look to Marx, and especially to that distinctive form of Marxism that captured MacIntyre's allegiance in the early, in the 1950s and early 1960s. And when we do look to his writings from that period, we find that the Marxism that he propounded was a very humanistic Marxism, as Paul Blackledge and Neil Davidson have shown. And I think it was clearly a humanistic Marxism that was deeply and explicitly indebted to Hegel. So what I aim to do in this paper is to highlight the ways in which MacIntyre has always been interpreting Marx and therefore also Hegel through Aristotelian lenses and vice versa, despite various fairly significant shifts in vocabulary and allegiance. Early in his career, MacIntyre embraced a Hegelian notion of freedom as the human essence, realizable only through social practices and institutions for which persons have taken collective responsibility. And even at this point, MacIntyre is inclined to interpret freedom through Aristotelian spectacles as the happiness that's made possible by desires that are transformed in and for community. Talk of Hegel recedes in tandem with MacIntyre's disillusionment with Marxism, but nevertheless, MacIntyre's Aristotelianism and later his Thomism retain a markedly Hegelian flavor. His quest for the final good, for the universal, unfolds by way of sorting through the social roles and practices and conceptions of human flourishing that have formed and deformed us. All of this comes into clearer focus with MacIntyre's return to Marxism in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity. Mike McNair of the Weekly Worker has written that MacIntyre's long-term influence in the academy has been toward the rehabilitation of violently conservative Catholic versions of Thomism. And I take MacIntyre to have rebuked these in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, albeit perhaps belatedly. What remains unresolved, I will argue, is whether MacIntyre's account is metaphysical in ways that post-Kantian Hegelians would reject. So to begin with MacIntyre's early career, essays from the mid-1950s often speak of Marx and Hegel in tandem. MacIntyre denounces, to be sure, what he characterizes as the detestable political attitudes of Hegel's old age, claiming to prove that the Prussian monarchy was an authentic embodiment of freedom, but he does not see this as the authentic core of Hegel's thought. Instead, in several important essays from 1960, we find MacIntyre endorsing Hegel's notion of freedom as the essence of man. To say that freedom is the human essence is to take human existence to be teleologically oriented to the realization of freedom. And MacIntyre takes Hegel to have grasped a key insight concerning the social character of human existence that continues to elude most of MacIntyre's own contemporaries. That, as he puts it, the problem of freedom is not the problem of the individual against society, but the problem of what sort of society we want and what sort of individuals we want to be. In order to realize freedom, we can't simply resist social practices and institutions we experience as coercive or oppressive, nor simply accept them as given. We must recognize these practices and institutions as objective spirit, as our own collective creation, for which we can and must take responsibility, transforming them in order to create a social world, a new Sittlichkeit, in which we can be at home. To assert oneself at the expense of the organization in order to be free, writes MacIntyre in 1960, is to miss the fact that only within some organizational form can human freedom be embodied. While he doesn't delve into even this modest level of engagement with Hegel's theoretical vocabulary, MacIntyre clearly recognizes that Hegel, taken at his best, and here I'm clearly reading Hegel in a much more dynamic way than Bob was in his wonderful paper. Hegel, taken at his best, does not simply bless his actual existing social and political institutions, but rather shows that insofar as they are not yet in harmony with the concept of freedom and community, they are subject to ongoing critique and reform. At this point in his career, MacIntyre regards Marx as having taken the next logical step beyond Hegel, that of moving to change the world in accordance with this understanding of it. While up until now, it has always been the case that human life has been constrained in various ways by the existing form of society, and realization of the human essence of freedom has therefore been sharply limited, MacIntyre proclaims that in our age, we have reached the point where this can change, where human possibility can be realized in a quite new way. Because MacIntyre understands Marx through Hegel, he's resistant to any notion of a mechanical relation between the economic structures of a society and its social consciousness, between basis and superstructure. He thus cautions that we cannot see the realization of this possibility as the predictable outcome of laws governing human development independently of human wills and aspirations. For the next stage is to be characterized precisely as the age in which human wills and aspirations take charge and are no longer subservient to economic necessity and to the law-bound inevitability of the past. Even at this relatively early stage in his career, we can see how MacIntyre's interpretation of Hegel and Marx is held together with a certain reading of Aristotle that was to loom larger as MacIntyre became disillusioned with Marxism. For we find threaded throughout a critique of happiness understood in terms of an individual's subjective satisfaction. As Thomas D'Andrea notes, a short history of ethics found Plato teaching us a permanent lesson about the rational criticism of desire, that a system of morality which is aimed at directing us towards our objective and progressively discoverable good must be a morality of desire transformation, a morality of the virtues. In Aristotle's in some ways dated political ethics, MacIntyre has found a promising core of related theses showing us how virtue, moral rules, life in community, and happiness are internally connected. As in his earlier Marxist writings, we find in this text from the mid-1960s the claim that ought and is, now described in terms of virtue and happiness, can be reconciled only by creating a form of community that brings them together. But by this point, MacIntyre had become disillusioned with Marxism. So it's important to ask why and to ask what this means in turn for his ongoing relationship to Hegel's thought. As MacIntyre witnessed how modern capitalism operated to fragment rather than to unify workers, he became increasingly pessimistic about the claim that we have arrived at an age in which human wills and aspirations can escape the constraints of economic necessity and create conditions of freedom for all. In Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, MacIntyre attributes to the Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James two of his own retrospective judgments of the failings of Marxism, failings he's careful not to attribute to Marx. That is, this 2016 discussion of James, in my view, sheds light on MacIntyre's own disillusionment with Marxism in the early 60s. First, James rejected the notion of the vanguard as teacher and leader of the oppressed. Rather, the exploited had to speak for themselves with their own voices, voices in the plural, out of their various cultural traditions, and to define their own goals. Second, James realized that Marxism had a defective understanding of human goods. What Marx had identified were those barriers to human flourishing, to the achievement of human goods that are presented by capitalist economies. But Marxism offered no adequate answer to the question of why the decently well-off under capitalism should struggle to overthrow it, and no real answer to the question of what kind of person I need to become in order to flourish as a human being, or of what virtues I need in order to avoid corruption and live into that good. MacIntyre's brief comments about Marxism and After Virtue, the work that would more than any establish his significance, are largely negative. He accuses Marxism there of collapsing into radical individualism, of failing to provide a viable alternative to the Aristotelian tradition, and of being exhausted as a political tradition. Marx and Marxism make no appearance at all in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, his next book. And Hegel, likewise, largely fades from view. In fact, MacIntyre argues that tradition constituted inquiry is anti-Hegelian, but he considers it anti-Hegelian in ruling out the possibility of knowing that one has arrived at absolute knowledge. And I'm taking it to be contested whether Hegel actually claims that that is possible. During this period, MacIntyre's talk of freedom as the human essence recedes, but his critique of subjective desire satisfaction, of the intelligibility of pleasure as a reason for action, remains. I say that the talk of freedom recedes because the Aristotelian notion of eudaimonia, or flourishing, plays much the same role as had the earlier invocations of freedom. Eudaimonia, the state of being well and doing well and being well, as he defines it, is achieved, as he writes in After Virtue, in a complete human life lived at its best, and the exercise of the virtues is a necessary and central part of such a life. He expresses reservations, as we've already discussed, about Aristotle's metaphysical biology, the view that human beings, like the members of all other species, have a specific nature, and that nature is such that they have certain aims and goals such that they move by nature toward a specific telos. These reservations, I think, stem from his Hegelian and Marxist conviction that human beings are essentially cultural and historical, and that thus the human telos cannot be articulated in a static way. Human beings can flourish only within the context of concrete practices and traditions, and these continually unfold through time. So he concludes, again, as has already been mentioned, that the good life for man is the life spent in seeking for the good life for man, an ongoing quest for the final good, the good which will enable us to order other goods. So this is, of course, merely a formal account. No one can live at this level of abstraction. We are what we inherit, but this means that we also inherit conflicts and tensions internal to the practices and communities we inhabit, and face new conflicts and tensions as we encounter other practices and communities and navigate amongst them. So he writes that it is in moving forward from such particularity that the search for the good, for the universal, consists. And here we hear echoes of the universal and the particular in Hegel. We are, that is, engaged in an ongoing process of sorting through the culturally and historically formed social roles and practices and conceptions of human flourishing that we've inherited. And the virtues equip us to discern how existing practices exclude and oppress, and how they stand in need of critique and transformation. While MacIntyre leaves behind his earlier talk of freedom as human essence and telos, his action theory remains the same as that found in his writings from the late 1950s. He writes, a statement only provides someone with a reason for action if it is relevant to his wants and needs. And that's in 1965, I think. Unless that was a reprint. Yet flourishing requires the transformation of desire, the acquisition of virtues by way of participating in particular historically situated practices and traditions. We're searching for desires and aversions that are standard for human beings. Interestingly, he writes that, standard for human beings. These cannot be statistical norms. They must be norms for what is humanly desire-worthy. Elizabeth Anscombe had laid down the gauntlet in 1958 with her declaration that when it comes to defending the claim that a person can flourish only by being virtuous, philosophically, there's a huge gap at present unfillable as far as we are concerned, which needs to be filled by an account of human nature, human action, the type of characteristic of virtue is, and above all, of human flourishing. Filling this gap was a key part of MacIntyre's agenda, but he was equally clear that any objective conception of human flourishing as a standard for what is humanly worthy of desiring would have to do justice to the Hegelian and Marxist insights into the socially and historically formed character of human flourishing, and thus also to the historically and socially sedimented obstacles to human flourishing. Even as by 1999, Independent Rational Animals, MacIntyre judged himself to have been in error in supposing an ethics independent of biology to be possible, he did not lose his commitment to thinking of human flourishing as essentially historical and cultural. He added an accent on human dependency and vulnerability, but this was really a corrective to a certain kind of Aristotelianism and very much in continuity with his earlier Hegelian Marxist insistence that freedom is always freedom in community, and thus a freedom in which we always remain fundamentally dependent on others. Statements that he makes in this vein as late as 2016 in Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity could have been taken from his Marxist essays of the 1950s. So he writes, individuals should understand that they can achieve their own individual goods only through achieving in the company of others, those common goods that we share as family members, as collaborators in the workplace, as participants in a variety of local groups and societies, and as fellow citizens. Ethical critique must offer a different way of life, not merely a different theory. Theory makes explicit what is implicit in forms of life, helping us to see how a form of life obstructs flourishing a community. Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity also marks an explicit return to Marxism. Now, however, MacIntyre emphasizes Marx's deep indebtedness to Aristotle and their shared concern for the development of human potentiality. MacIntyre argues that Marx helps us understand how money and profit came to be seen as ends in themselves, and how the rise of capitalism was bound up with the erosion of a shared intentional pursuit of common goods. Most significantly, MacIntyre's return to Marx allows him to clarify his critique of modernity. The critique that has gotten him branded as a traditionalist modernity critic, as a critique first and foremost of capitalism and the gross inequality to which this gives rise. And this in turn makes it possible for him to articulate how his defense of tradition is best grasped as pointing to the importance of securing the conditions for the possibility of democratic forms of politics that give a hearing to every relevant voice and argument in the shared pursuit of common goods. It's these communities of shared deliberation, not ossified traditions of deference to authority, that MacIntyre fears are being lost in the wake of global capitalism, the supremacy of rational choice and the pursuit of subjective happiness. Thus, even if MacIntyre does not say this in so many words, in order to arrive at Hegelian freedom, in order to be reconciled with, be at home in the world of objective spirit, we must recognize it as our own cultural creation, and hence also as our responsibility to correct and transform, and follow Marx in working toward radical transformation of the cultural and social order. So I have always read MacIntyre as in this respect fundamentally in step with the influential interpretations of Hegel advanced by post-Kantian thinkers like Terry Pinkert and Robert Pippin. Pinkert, for instance, writes that Hegel's view is that for agents to be free, they must be able to practically reason about their activities, and that requires that they have some conception of some good that they are seeking to actualize. As he goes on to add, if we are to have any concrete first principles for moral reasoning, therefore, we must grasp them not as specifications of some master rule, but as elements of a social practice, ways in which we pre-reflectively learn to orient and move ourselves around in the social world. Or as Pippin insists, for Hegel, freedom requires a certain sort of self-relation, itself possible only as embedded within certain relations to others. We always reason from an institutional position, and if we abstract from that position in an attempt at idealization, we abstract from the conditions of the possibility of practical rationality. Hegel conceives of practical rationality as a social practice and has a historicized or dialogical view of what counts as the appeal to reasons. All of this could as easily be said of MacIntyre as of Hegel. Thus far, I've bracketed MacIntyre's Thomistic Aristotelianism, in part because this is not a continuous through line in his career, unlike the Hegelian, Marxist, and Aristotelian themes that I've highlighted up to this point. MacIntyre is a Christian at the outset of his career, then an atheist, then again a Christian, returning by way of his conviction that it was Thomistic Aristotelianism that successfully carried the Aristotelian tradition forward. He has then become a Christian philosopher, but resolutely not a theologian. He's strikingly reticent to issue theological pronouncements. For a number of years, he seemed content to be appropriated by conservative Catholic neo-Thomism. I take him, though, in Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity to be rejecting that appropriation quite firmly. His praise for Oscar Wilde and D.H. Lawrence seem calculated to offend socially conservative Catholics, and of the 4 exemplary figures with which the book concludes, only one, Denis Fall, is a Catholic. Tellingly, in lifting up Sandra Day O'Connor, MacIntyre highlights her resistance to approaching the issue of abortion as a matter to be dealt with by appeal to indefeasible principles, rather than by attention to the particular context and circumstances of each case, another rebuke to conservative Catholicism. In this book, moreover, MacIntyre underscores that early 20th century Thomism was aligned with emerging Catholic social teaching in issuing claims addressed to persons of all faith or none regarding the nature of human goods, the requirements of justice, and the ordering of institutions. This Thomist distributism bettered the Marxism of the day in grasping the dangers of concentrating power in the hands of the state and the ruling political party, in understanding the malformation of the desires of members of all classes by capitalism, and in focusing on grassroots cooperative enterprises rather than pinning its hopes on the emergence of a revolutionary working class. But none of these arguments required theological premises. I don't mean to imply that MacIntyre's Christian faith is either insincere or irrelevant. Clearly, just as he has been pushing back against those who would appropriate him as a mouthpiece for socially conservative Catholicism, he's also pushed back against those who would write him off as a worthwhile conversation partner because of his Christian allegiances. Contrary to the view that traditions are somehow insulated from one another, incapable of mutual understanding and engagement, MacIntyre seeks to show how a Thomistic Aristotelian understanding of practical reasoning can be embodied by persons of multiple faiths or no faith at all, even as he thinks that the best theorizing of practical reason is found within that particular tradition of reflection. MacIntyre's theological convictions surface only a few times in Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, most notably on the final page. But the language of final end and final good are prominent in MacIntyre's latest book in a way that they never have been before. The attempt to order the various practices in which we are engaged and the goods towards which we are oriented opens up the task of integrating our lives, of discerning the final good towards which we are directed, insofar as other goods are each given their proper place in our lives. So we get the questing, we still get the questing, maybe reclaimed more fully, that was present in After Virtue, but we have this new element of thinking about the ordering of the various goods into a coherent whole. This final good, in contrast to goods that are appropriate to pursue in this or that context or to this or that extent, is thus unqualifiedly good. A person who has journeyed along the path of grasping the goods internal to practices, who's developed the virtues that enable pursuit of these goods, and who's taken up the task of determining how it is best for her to live qua human being or qua rational agent, and not simply as a participant in one or another practice or as an inhabitant of one or another role, is poised, MacIntyre writes, to recognize that the final end is inescapably theological in character. As he writes, the nature of her practical reasoning and of the practical reasoning of those in whose company she deliberates has from the outset committed her and them to a shared belief in God, to a belief that if there is nothing beyond the finite, there is no final end, no ultimate human good to be achieved. So she may complete her reasoning by discovering that what is at stake in her decisions in moments of conflict is the directedness of her life, if not toward God, at least beyond finitude. What does this mean? What we discover in the course of our efforts properly to order the particular goods we encounter, and what MacIntyre is trying to illustrate in these stories of Grossman, O'Connor, James, and Flau, is that the good life is one in which no particular finite good is treated as necessary for living well. That is, in which none of these finite goods is treated as the final good. In grasping this, we grasp ourselves as directed beyond these finite goods. Hence, we complete and perfect our lives by allowing them to remain incomplete. And this, MacIntyre takes pains to point out, is perfectly possible for those who have no religious allegiance. But it may at the same time be regarded as a form of negative theology, he calls it natural theology, which approaches God by renouncing the idolatry of finite goods. MacIntyre's refusal to give a more fully fleshed out account of the good life or of our final end is thus a theological statement about how the final good leaves room for all the myriad particular goods that make up human lives, and also about how the loss of these goods can be borne. It becomes clear here just how Augustinian MacIntyre's Aristotelianism is or has become, an Augustinianism that's underscored by the final sentences of the book, which point to a good toward which desire tends insofar as it remains unsatisfied by even the most desirable of finite goods, which I think casts his early discussion of the quest in After Virtue in a new light, because it suggests that anything that would be beyond the quest would have to be eschatological, beyond history. What does this talk of final end and ultimate good, of God and natural theology, mean for MacIntyre's relationship to Hegel? I take it that MacIntyre, like Hegel, is bending many conventional uses of the word God. Indeed, MacIntyre is even more reticent than Hegel to use the word, since it is so likely to lead to misunderstanding. I take it further that MacIntyre would be sympathetic with Pippen's understanding of what is going on in Hegel's comments about nature as the development of a world spirit, namely that, as Pippen puts it, at a certain level of complexity and organization, natural organisms come to be occupied with themselves and eventually to understand themselves in ways no longer appropriately explicable within the boundaries of nature or in any way the result of empirical observation. Pippen stresses here the human capacity to attempt to understand nature properly in its truth, to get it right, while MacIntyre stresses the human capacity to grasp the good. Of both, one can say this is a project for the understanding of which the appeal to merely natural properties cannot be adequate. This project is what MacIntyre characterizes as being directed beyond finitude, to God. He simply doesn't say enough about God, that word, to determine whether his account is metaphysical in the ways that post-Kantian Hegelians reject. I have in my own work found it illuminating to interpret Hegel through the lens of the Bildung tradition, centrally constituted by those late 18th and early 19th century German thinkers who grasped the culturally formed, self-forming agency of human beings and took up the individual and collective realization of humanity as an aesthetic, ethical, spiritual, and political task, from Herder and Humboldt to Goethe, Schiller, and Hegel. This tradition is unintelligible without reference to a theological conception of humankind as created in the image of God and called to play a special role in the return of creation to God by way of knowing and loving all things, including self and neighbor in relation to God. This Bildung tradition was a site for the working out of the radical social and political implications of this doctrine, and at the same time for experimentation with more and less radical reworkings of its theological premises. What for Herder was a matter of participating in a providentially ordered process of the differentiation and harmonious integration of natural and social worlds became in the hands of Humboldt, Goethe, and Schiller a site of independent human self-forming activity, the telos of which is the overcoming of internal and external divisions and the reconciliation of opposing psychic and social forces. Hegel, too, takes up the project of Bildung as one of reconciliation, and the phenomenology has aptly been considered a Bildungsroman of the human spirit. Hegel sought to illuminate the conceptual structure of reality, making it possible for consciousness to be at home in the world by finding it intelligible, by creating practices and institutions that are appropriate dwelling places for creatures of reason. Bildung requires for Hegel the harmony and diversity of subjects who, grasping themselves and one another as finite expressions of the concept, form relationships and institutions that embody mutual recognition and affirmation. I don't think that Hegel here is merely clarifying how things must appear to us. I take him to be engaged in an ontological inquiry that seeks to say how things actually are, even as all such claims are fallible and open to contestation. If God is affirmed as radically transcendent, God is not a substance alongside others, not a member of the class of beings. This is affirmed, albeit rather inconsistently, within philosophical theology. My sense is that MacIntyre clearly rejects spirit monism, but he might well accept something like a revised metaphysical interpretation of Hegel, according to which finite things are particularized universals, expressions of an infinite, not to be thought of as a substance, as has been developed by Robert Stern. To my knowledge, this is not something MacIntyre anywhere articulates. He would, I take it, reject any notion that God requires the historical process in order to be God, or that regards God as it realized only in and through a historical process of becoming. When it is argued that the perfection of something called God is attained in and through the historical process, evil is rationalized, even if it is contingent and even if it is negated. Unbearable weight is placed on the historical process to secure the eschaton. In contrast, whereas for MacIntyre, the final good is revealed through the process of discovering the limits of all particular and finite goods, a kind of God talk may be recuperable that is at once sensitive to the failures of theologies of God as greatest thing around, of spirit monism, and of any atheistic divinization of the historical process. So I suppose one might say I'm arguing that where Hegel's theology goes adrift, MacIntyre's theology provides a potential corrective, even if it's one that remains highly underdeveloped. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk and this provocative suggestion. We have questions coming up. I see Caleb has one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's incredibly enlightening, and I agree. I think I understand your position, and I think I agree that we shouldn't see this kind of shift in MacIntyre in the later work in terms of kind of fundamentally turning away from this kind of Hegelian, post-Kantian kind of perspective. But I'm wondering about whether there's still kind of a significant tension in terms of his conception of like the role of religious authority. Again, when we think in whose justice, which rationality, and I mean, he seems to have an anti-Hegelian understanding of, you might say like a Catholic understanding of religious authority that's in tension with the role of Protestantism in Hegel's thought and this idea. So, I mean, I just wonder, is it coherent to kind of elaborate on the role of, religious authority within rationality, which again, I take him to be doing in whose justice, which rationality, and to still maintain a kind of post-Kantian sort of subjectivity. It seems there's some sort of tension, even though I agree. I mean, he sticks it in the face of kind of conservative Catholics, I think, in the latest book. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm inclined to think that yes, there are some moments of tension there, and I, in part, I think there is self-correction going on in ethics and the conflicts of modernity. It's not just kind of a re-articulation, but I suspect, well, my own sense is that he has never really fully worked out how the allegiance to institutional church authority that he has embraced is to be reconciled with everything else in his philosophy. And I'm not sure, that may be one reason why he's so reticent to say theological things, because it's just not clear how that would be consistent. I take to be very authentic what he does say in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity about the final good and this, or what he reads that as an orientation to God. But that is much more like this questing notion. God remains radically transcendent. There's very little that one can say about God, and then to try to put that into the within the constraints of institutional Catholicism just seems to kind of not fundamentally not be consistent.
Thank you. Robert Stern.
Yeah, thanks very, very much, Jennifer. So I suppose I'm rather selfishly asking this from slightly the perspective of my paper, but I think there were interesting connections, but perhaps differences. So, and then, I mean, one place this came out was the way you very interestingly, wanted to, I think you're reading him more continuous perhaps than I am overall, which is fine, but also the way you wanted to bring in the turn to the theological, in a way following out of the quest idea, when you think, well, okay, but we're still basically working with finite goods that we're working through, and then there's a question of, well, we need a final good, and that's got to be beyond the finite goods that we're working through in our various practices. And then, as you said, at that point, you have a push for the eschatological. But the way I'd been, maybe wrongly, but the way I'd been trying to understand the MacIntyre of After Virtue's idea of the quest is there may not be a final good, because the good is the quest, putting it that way. Right. So then you don't need some further step beyond, however you want to understand that, the quest, because the good resides within it. Now, of course, that might be a rather dialectical way of understanding, theology. There is no transcendent good, but you often use the word transcendence when presenting it. So I'm just wondering if you read it a bit more my way. I mean, again, using, say, the relationship analogy, it's not like in the relationship we are working towards some final good that we might one day get to accomplish, and that will be wonderful. But what the good just is what I was trying to call a dynamic good. The good just is that process. So then you don't need a final good in that sense, or a push for something eschatological or theological in any transcendent sense, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you. And it really was helpful to hear you develop all of that. And I'm still thinking it through. But I suppose I would say even in After Virtue, the good life is not just the quest. The good life is a quest for human flourishing. So the good life will be a life of human flourishing. But he doesn't know what to say about that, and is very hesitant to pin it down because of his keen awareness of historicity and contingency and particularity, as well as of the failings of any past and present conception of human flourishing. So then I take it as he proceeds through his career, he's certainly in Dependent Rational Animals, for example, we get much more of an insistence that whatever human flourishing is, it can't be contradictory to our animal nature, right? It has to be consistent both with our animal nature and with our historical nature. So I guess basically I am saying that I think there is continuity, and that implicit in that very early After Virtue notion of the quest is a notion that the quest involves living well with, ordering well these finite goods, and that contains an implicit reference to a final good that is going to be beyond all of those. So it's a very different. You can articulate the relationship of finite to final good non-historically, but because he's such a historicist, because he is coming where he is, he wants to think it through historically as well. So that's you're going to get a reference to transcendence, and you're going to get the insistence that it can never be completely arrived at historically. hence my invocation of the eschatological.
Yeah, but I mean, partly it's not clear why you get that claim. I mean, who knows? Maybe we will get there. I mean, again, but also, I mean, it makes the slogan much, again, I'm not really a McIntyrean, but much less interesting, because, I mean, what he should have said is the good life is something we must quest for. We don't know it now. We have to look for it. But he says the good life consists in that quest. And that's what leads me to this idea of dynamic good. I mean, it's a much more radical claim. Now, maybe he didn't quite mean that, but if he did, then I think that undercuts the need for any further final good beyond the quest, because the good life is the quest. So there is no further good.
Right. Well, the theological translation is the good life is the life spent seeking God. And the life spent seeking God never comes to an end. Right. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So the goodness consists in the seeking.
Yes. So even if you make the theological translation, you can keep that in there.
Yeah, but then you, in a way, God drops out, right? Because you don't need this further thing to arrive at to complete the good life.
Well, I mean, I think what he's saying in Ethics in the Conflict of Modernity is you can quest for the good life without articulating the final end as God, but you can also articulate the final end as God, and that's what he does. Is, you know, as a person of faith, and he thinks that that's providing further intelligibility to the ways in which the final good transcends all finite goods. But he's certainly not saying that you can't do it without God talk in the room.
Good. Anyway, we could continue this.
Yeah, we can continue.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
I hope there'll be chances. Matthias Hase next.
Yeah, thank you. I found it incredibly helpful how you stressed the continuity of the topics in the different works. But I was wondering whether the what one might call the Thomistic turn is not doesn't mark an important shift, and one of them is something he explicitly rejects in After Virtue is the idea of the unity of the virtues, whereas he later says, well, that was a great error. We need an account of the unity of the virtues, and he thinks one can't get it from Aristotle, but only from Aquinas. And in the specific way in which he reads Aquinas focusing in dependent rational animals on our vulnerability. So I was wondering, doesn't this mark a more striking turn in his work, despite the continuities you pointed out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a significant shift. I see it as a shift within a broader continuity, but it is a shift from a perspective on which conflict and tragedy are sort of the final reality, let's say, to a perspective in which they just play a role within a broader harmonious whole. That is not a surprising shift. I mean, it would be more surprising to find somebody who embraces a Christian identity and yet says tragedy and conflict sort of go all the way down. So that's, I suppose, not that surprising. There are theological critics of McIntyre who say he never goes far enough. That is just by virtue of the fact that dialectic makes debate, conflict so central to moving forward in the quest for the good. That's already giving conflict too central a role. But that certainly does not change in his thought ever. Dialectic remains absolutely critical.
Thank you.
Calling on Gennady McCracken next.
Hello. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Now, perhaps I misunderstood something, but it struck me that you might have been suggesting that McIntyre thinks that there are infinite goods within the access of secular people. And I was wondering if that's correct, if maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So what I was suggesting is that the ongoing task that confronts all practical reasoners of ordering finite goods in some coherent way, and that is a task that he takes to be unending, that the human life is a life of never-ending effort to order finite goods and to properly recognize their finitude. And I was suggesting that that's certainly something that he sees as open to persons, regardless of whatever their religious convictions or lack of convictions are. And I think it's quite significant that, you know, I've said this already, but, you know, he ends Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity with these 4 exemplary figures, all of whom he takes to be living a good life. They're living a good life insofar as they're engaged in this activity of this you know, ongoing attempt to order finite goods, and that is the pursuit of the final good, which MacIntyre named as God, despite the fact that most of these figures are exemplary without naming that as God.
Thank you.
Yep.
I've put myself there on Stack for a second. I want to thank you for drawing attention to those final pages of Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity. I think they're among the most richest and interesting in MacIntyre. The question has 2 parts. The first one is sort of, it seems to me that the purpose of these remarks there at the very end is in some sense defensive. I kind of read him as you know, putting them into ward of a danger, which is sort of the absolutization of finite goods, a form of idolatry, perhaps in theological parlance. So my first question is whether you would agree that this is sort of the primary purpose of those remarks there, and then building on that, and thinking about also Robert Stern's talk. Do you think it's conceivable that MacIntyre thinks that the quest itself might be absolutized in a kind of pernicious sort of romantic direction, where we search so excessively and wildly that there are forms of, you know, maybe that would even be a mistaken conception of what it means to search. But I mean, and I'm thinking about Travis and the film and you know, and the waltz, and I think, you know, there is a way about people, about these sort of romantic heroes who break with all conventions, throwing a lot of other people under the bus in you know, when they go about their personal radical questing or something like that. So I like, but more philosophically, is there a way in which this sort of theological check on all finite goods could extend even to the good of searching? Or is that a different kind of good? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree, first of all, completely with what you said about you know, what he's saying as a pushback against or a corrective to the potential idolization of finite goods. I agree with that. So to this potential absolutizing of the quest itself and whether that could be pernicious, that's a very interesting question. I don't think he confronts it. I do think it is a possibility, but what I'll say is it was so interesting to me to see him recovering that emphasis on the quest in this book, because it had not really been a significant theme since After Virtue, and he goes back and he reclaims it. And in asking myself, you know, why? I mean, I do think that, you know, ultimately, I think the theological is part of the answer why. But also, I think really important is that he wanted to show how this process of what I've talked about is ordering finite goods and so on. It's not just that. It's also a process of identifying the injustices in one's own, the social order that one is inhabiting, and devoting one's energy to combating those. So if we think about, oh gosh, is he overemphasizing the quest and, you know, romanticizing it and so on? While that's a danger, I think what he's really underscoring here is these are exemplary lives, because these were people who, they weren't you know, they weren't preoccupied with maximizing their subjective life satisfaction. They were actually spending themselves and their energies in combating, you know, injustices. So, you know, back to Hegel, who's getting short shrift in this conversation. But you know, I'm attracted to this reading of Hegel, whereby we never arrive at the end point until all of these conflicts are worked through, and these conflicts are actually conflicts that are born in the lives of people who are suffering from oppression and exploitation. And I think that's what MacIntyre is feeling the need to underscore at this point in his life. You know, and it's part and parcel of I think also part and parcel of pushing back against a view of him as, you know, okay, now you're just in the bosom of the church and that's all you care about. No, I care about combating social injustices. And these are the people that I admire, who are questing, and that's the form the quest takes in their lives.
Thank you. Got Caleb and Ahmad, and then I think we'll close that there and take a break. Caleb.
Yeah, thanks. Since we have time, I just wanted to ask one related question to what I asked before. I mean, you know, it strikes me, especially, I mean, you know, in your reading of this later pages in the latest book, that MacIntyre is kind of close to a sort of liberal Protestant theology, even though, you know, he had long been a critic of this. But I mean, again, like, I mean, I think of like, you know, Paul Tillich or like, you know, Ron, are of course Catholic, but I mean, like, you know, kind of influenced by this. So, I mean, I'm curious whether you think that, you know, and this idea of God as being unknowable, and this, you know, I mean, again, it seems pretty interesting that, you know, this is what plays such a fundamental role, as opposed to, you know, some of these other trends that have kind of, you might say, more conservative. They're trying to push against that, you know, within a kind of theological, you know, debate.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess what I would say is that the you know, Thomas Aquinas grasped the radical transcendence of God is central to Thomas Aquinas's theology, and is central to medieval theology in ways that were fundamentally lost sight of by modern theology, and in particular by much of liberal Protestant thought. So I certainly wouldn't think that he would well, I don't think you're suggesting that he would see it as liberal Protestantism, but I guess I'm not, it's more post-liberal, more post-liberal turn to try to recover some of those, a more apophatic, a more negative theology, or at least a theology that couples all the stuff that gets said about God with a reminder that actually nothing can be said about God. And so I think it could be seen as actually recovering a more fully Thomistic theology than he had prior.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of maybe more recent, you know, I mean, some of the criticisms of like the, you know, say the sort of Balthasarian kind of, you know, there's almost this, you know, as if we have this kind of intricate knowledge of what God is doing, and, you know, it very much not a negative theology, you know, it's, I mean, even though he's been lumped together with some of this, you know, it seems that he's very much opposed, you know, and
mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Thanks. Ahmad.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much. So I wonder if there is a way to kind of split this difference. So it seems to me, Alistair needs a conception of God, or telos, that's in some sense transcendent. But this comes after virtue, when the kind of open-ended conception of the good that MacIntyre offered, that Bob restates in After Virtue, comes under attack for failing to obtain, or rather obtaining, a kind of interminable set of goods that kind of undermine his overall thesis in after virtue against emotivism and kind of liberal ethics. But one issue, I guess, is, and I think, Jennifer, you pointed this out, is whether this kind of transcendent conception of the good that MacIntyre offers, it's somewhat kind of, it's a bit of a deus ex machina in the sense of Greek tragedy, that it's not clearly kind of not enough content to tell us, you know, what it, you know, kind of what it amounts to, kind of more in kind of theological terms. And part of that is because MacIntyre is very much historical and heavily kind of leaning on the kind of tradition base, and most of the kind of framework or the that he inherits prior to after virtue.
Sorry, could you just restate that last point? Because I thought you were going to continue and you stopped.
Yeah,
so
yeah. So
maybe I didn't know.
So the last point was basically that when the issue, one issue with this kind of bringing a kind of a transcendent conception in, or a kind of a conception, at least he calls it in Ethics in the Conflict of Modernity, at least a telos beyond this world, where we need to be like, where the conception would need to kind of be directed. But the issue is kind of this, that there is there's a lack of kind of content of what this amounts to. So I give the analogy of the Greek tragedy. So the deus ex machina, you know, comes in and, you know, it's resolved, but you're not sure what the resolution is exactly is.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess that's why I actually do see it as rather continuous with after virtue, as opposed to a departure from it, because I think it's the way he characterizes this transcendent telos. It's a reminder of the finitude of finite goods. It's an ongoing quest to order them appropriately. You know, so if this is talking about God, you're right. There's not a lot of content given to God here, but I think that's consistent with the way that MacIntyre has talked all along. So it really is underscoring the endlessness of the quest, while at the same time claiming there is an end, right? In that sense, he's being apodictic. There is an end, but it's not one that can be ever realized in this life. So if there's a, you know, if that's what Hegel is claiming, then he's saying Hegel has a prematurely realized eschatology. That's the problem. The problem is the notion that this goal would be articulated here and now. Yeah, so I don't see it. I mean, yes, I mean, obviously in some significant sense, there is change after virtue, because he embraces this Christianity that he had left behind. But in other respects, I see him as just finding new vocabulary to articulate ideas that he was probably, in essence, what I would say is that what he said in After Virtue about the quest was a secularized version of a Christian theme, and then he just re-Christianizes it later. So that's how I see the continuity.